This subject of soft power and its importance to Asia and globalization, it's a very interesting topic to talk about. And so today we'll be focusing a lot on this subject, and you will hear Alice's view on this. But just a little bit of background. This gentleman called Joseph Nye, back in about 3 decades ago, created the concept of soft power. He also argued that although he is from the States, and he argued that although the United States seemed relatively weaker than it had been at the World War II, the country still had a unique source of power to bring to the world, to do things to kind of control others without use of military power, and then to draw down this non-coercive power and to cement a leadership position into the world is this concept. And so generally, soft power now becomes a persuasive approach to an international relations, typically involving the use of some cultural or economic influence. I thought, once we decided on this topic, Alice, I thought it was very, very interesting, especially with you in Hong Kong. And I just want to pick your brain. I mean, in your opinion, in general, how important is soft power in its insertion of the impact of the world nowadays? Is it as important as 3 decades ago?
That's a really great question. Thank you, Henrietta, for that. And I think for soft power, what I find interesting is Professor Nye's quote is very interesting from 3 decades ago, but soft power for me goes back longer than that. And in fact, as I was reading, I came across a review from a book. Peter Gordon from Asian Review of Books is reviewing this book called Superpower Interrupted, The Chinese History of the World, written by Michael Schumann. And in it, Professor Michael Schumann argues that Chinese culture allowed China to maintain influence well beyond any actual power it might have held, especially during period of weakness and disunity. He calls it soft power, something modern China maybe is trying to restore. So in terms of soft power, if you look at China, if you look at the time of the China's influence, when it was kind of starting out in the beginning, about a couple of decades ago, a couple of centuries ago, the way it influences the country, its neighbors around Korea and Japan and its tributary states, Vietnam and all that. So soft power for me goes far back than that, and I think in some ways China had soft power. It really didn't fight to conquer Korea or Japan. It kind of let its cultural influences influence it. So for me, soft power is not just is a contemporary or modern concept. It actually goes back quite a long ways.
Come to think of it, you're very right. When we think about the Silk Road and the purpose of the Silk Road and how the Chinese made use of the Silk Road to first, before trading, they would transport dancers, performers, cultural artists to start this journey and to reach a certain countries where they wanted to visit and do trade with, and then the trades and the business will come. You're very right. So this concept of soft power would have been from a very, very long time. But if we go back to Professor Nye's concept in the modern world and just a little bit about the United States, do you think up today, can America still sustain its soft power in the world, and by what? By contemporary art, by its dance, or by what means, or film? Or is it losing its attractiveness given all the strong political battles and concepts that's going around the world with the leader led by Trump?
I think, in the United States, as a Chinese American, and then we were just recently celebrated the 4th of July, 254 years of the United States history. I think the U.S., a country like the U.S., which is a democracy, it's more than just the current president, Trump himself. I mean, Trump has been in power for almost 4 years now, and we'll see in November elections. So yes, he definitely has disrupted the U.S. The standing in the world, and soft power definitely is going to be an area where he definitely has some influence. But if you look at the long run, and that's how I look at soft power, Can it take roots? It's not just a trend. I would argue, like a few weeks ago, we hosted the International Day of Yoga with the Indian Consul General. And if you recall, the International Day of Yoga was initiated by the Prime Minister of India, Modi, about 5 or 6 years ago to promote yoga as a
soft power of India.
Some would argue a soft power tool of India.
Yes.
But yoga has been around.
That's right.
And so it's even without him promoting, it's still there. But I think he is actually thought it was a good way of getting people to know more about India today, and not just India of old. So I think soft power, long as it has roots, I think, and I look at, in some way you could argue Renaissance Italy, long as anything that has roots, if it takes root, so even if something, you cut the branches, it can grow back. And so that's why I think American soft power, I don't think it's gone, or it's definitely being impacted. But if you look at the artists, if you look at the institutions, so when I look at soft power, I look at institution. Trump is an individual. His administration, he is the head of the executive branch, but the U.S. has other branches of government. But also the civic society, the civil society in the U.S. Is alive and well. If you look at all the foundations, and also Asia Society is a good example of that. We were founded in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller III. So Asia Society was founded in 1956. Asia Society Hong Kong is 30 years. We were founded in 1990. So there are a lot of organizations and NGOs like Asia Society in the United States, the foundations, museums, government, city, and city, states. So it's not the United States. Fortunately, it's not just one person. So I do believe that the soft power of the United States will still be around and be alive and well. And it's also up to the people, also the young people. If you look at what's going on now with the Black Lives Matters, regardless how you feel about it, the energy of the United States. And also another area where I think the soft power of the United States is also going to be quite continuous. As an immigration, I think long as U.S. is a nation of immigrants, and that hybridity, that connectivity connects U.S. to Europe, connect U.S. to Asia, connect U.S. to Africa. So I think that also contributes to its continuity and sustainability and longevity of its soft power.
That's really very, very informative and great insight, and that is also very encouraging for people who are in the art, in the culture, and in the making, like continuously in the States, right? So apart from the States, which countries do you think are doing well in this in Europe, like in the West? I just kind of want to focus in a little bit in art and culture, just because I'm from this area, and because we're here at Asia Society. Which countries do you think are doing a good approach, like Germany or other places in Europe?
I think in Europe, I think Germany definitely is up there, and I had hoped. My rule of thumb has always been any countries or that's inclusive. If you're open to new idea, that soft power will, like I say, will keep on growing. And I think Germany has a bit of that, but unfortunately, I think in Europe right now, unfortunately, all around the world, there is a bit of looking in. Everybody is looking inward.
Yeah.
Even pre-COVID. I mean, if you look at Brexit and the
and that's very much instigated by certain leaders of the world.
Correct.
Not Merkel, but like other places like. And that's why I think my proposition is that sometimes this very overpowering political environment would kind of affect and temper, like taint the continuing growth of soft power and mixing of cultures.
I would argue that the politics of it, and because of the politic of it, soft power is even more important.
Okay.
So you need that dynamism. You need that kind of tug of war. I think Germany is a good example. I think they've been very inclusive and opening up and to new ideas. The economy, it's quite dynamic. Other countries around Europe and also Asia, we're all kind of looking at issues and kind of trying to understand our world today. And technology plays a big role in it. And so, but also demographics. I find that countries with younger demographics too also contribute to this dynamism, to this growth, to this, and in fact, if I look at it, I do think Korea has that dynamism quite a bit. In Asia, I think in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, I think that the dynamism of the youth also will contribute to the soft power of a country, I think.
It's very interesting that you mentioned Korea and also technology, because my next question is that I want to focus a little bit more on, it's about Asia's soft power and its influence and importance to the rest of the world. And including Korea, what are your observations and intuition on this subject? With high technology, like technological advancement, like countries like Japan and Korea, it seems like both countries have been very successful, whether in its cultural impact to the world, its cuisines, its pop culture, K-pop, J-pop, and and making use of the arts. Do you think they're very successful using this soft power to reshape their identities in the world?
I think they have been very successful using that. I think if I look back in when I was kind of growing up in the States, look at how much the Walkman influence at Sony. We all had remember our first
Yes.
Walkmans, and so.
I've never seen one. What is a Walkman?
Well, I think if you ask your kids, I think those are antiquated. They had no idea of. But if you look at the technology, so the corporates, and I also remember when the Van Gogh irises was auctioned in one of the Japanese conglomerate bought it and then also so that energy of technology as well as arts and culture, that growth, that Japanese growth. But look at what happened, right? Japan kind of went into stagnation. So, but this Japanese soft power continued. I think you're seeing it in whether it's a gaming. Anime, manga, J-pop,
contemporary art.
Yeah, and the art scene, the artists,
and its cuisine,
and it's still. I mean, look at sushi. I mean, right now, I think it's become a world cuisine, no longer just a Japanese cuisine. Korea is following in that footstep as well now with K-pop, and then this year when Parasite won the Oscar as the first Asian film to win a Best Picture Oscar. Not Best Foreign Picture, but Best Picture Oscar.
How did you feel about this?
I was really proud.
Asian immigrant to the States.
Also as a film lover, I've been watching the Oscars since I was a kid, and I rarely seen an Asian winning an Oscar. And did you know, trivia, first Asian to win an Oscar was like 1950 something for a movie that's quite dated, Sayonara, so by a Japanese woman. So those are things that I feel Korea, I think, has broken ground. Has kind of broken, and part of it is a problem of Hollywood. Why are we talking about the Oscar so white scandal, issue, and institutionally, Hollywood has not been as inclusive of minorities and women in terms of like directors and so on and so forth. So those are questions that are now being asked. But can Korea sustain it? Can Japan sustain it? I think Japanese, despite the economic downturn, their culture in terms of, you look at the artists, architects, it's still there. And Korea, I think, has a possibility of sustaining it. But going back to the India question, the Korean government has also invested in the film industry. They've invested in it. They want Korean culture to be up there and be proud of it, rightly so. But if the government take the investment away for whatever reason, then what happened? Can it continue? So for me right now, the question is sustainability. In fact, I asked the question of the professor from Seoul National University who looks at heart power relationship, and he was quite skeptical. He was not so sure that is this a trend, or is that going to take root? And it's, for me, I hope it'll take root, and not just Korean culture, but also Asian culture in general. Because it's time that I think the West look at Asia in a different way, rather than still sometimes through also colonial lenses, or maybe through lenses that are still not Asia today. And this is where I really think when Korea and Japan has, and even Taiwan to an extent. I remember some of the films of Ang Lee, and then the artists from China, the Xi Jinpings, the Ai Weiwei. I hope this will help the West or the rest of the world look at Asia differently through the arts and culture, through its soft power. So when I look at soft power now, I tend to look at it in a bigger Asian soft power, because when the West look at Asians, they don't distinguish whether you're Japanese, Chinese. In fact, I think unfortunately with the discrimination, the anti-Asian discrimination because of COVID, we've heard that the anti-Asian discrimination in Canada, US, Australia, other parts of the world, they don't distinguish if you're Chinese or you're Japanese. The violence is hit on all who look the same. So I think for me, Asia soft power has a lot of potential to grow. And Korea, Japan, China, we all can kind of contribute to that ultimate.
This is getting very, very interesting, Alice, because although we are both Asian, we look the same, but it beats me because I'm from Hong Kong more, and it just blows my mind that when you mentioned that in the West, they don't people don't distinguish from Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, and other countries. And if we just take a small look at how history progressed and all the intricate stories amongst these countries, it really is quite mind-blowing. The other subject that you talked about it's financial resources, finances, and versus the development of soft power. From my observation, I agree with you totally that in Japan and Korea we can see it. Like any layman can see that the investments both from institutions, large corporates, and also the government over the past decades in development of their influences. However, we can notice that actually because I spent some time in China in the past few years to study, to understand its cultural development, and I do think that China understands this also. It has the Cultural Ministry of China, it's very organized, and it has definitely plans and has done a lot in development of continued development of its influence, like from what we earlier discussed on years ago. So we probably can see this firing up of the cultural scene in China with many, many museums growing up, both privately and publicly, including like Westbound Long Museum and other parts of China, not just in Shanghai and Beijing. And what do you think China can do again, or further, or to reconnect, given the situation now, to reconnect itself to the world? And do you think that this will help China continue develop its modernity and its image to the world?
Well, I think that's a really good question. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, especially this last 8 years being here at Asia Society in Hong Kong. And as a Chinese American, my own background is I was born in Taiwan. I left when I was 10. My first language is Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. And growing up in the States as a minority and then being able to work in Hong Kong in the 90s. Before I came back to Hong Kong 8 years ago, I was in New York for almost a decade. From my perspective, as this hybrid, Chinese American, which I'm very proud of, I am Chinese. This is my first character is my last name Mong, right?
Mong.
So I think the identity issue is really important. It's something that that I think sometimes we lost sight of, when we look at where we are today, and I find that one of the things that I have to learn as a Chinese American is about humility, to be humble, and something that I learned when I was a kid in Taiwan growing up, humility, being humble. And I think China should be applauded for this last the 3 decades of growth. I mean, China has done so much. and culturally should be proud of itself too. If we look at our 5,000, growing up in Taiwan, 5,000 year of Chinese culture. So I think China has a lot to be proud of, and modern China. And if you look at the artists, if I look at the artists, like, we have a Gu Wendai here, we have a Xu Bing, we have, some of the artists that you represent. And in fact, that's kind of how I met you, was the Hao Liang and Tang Wei, when I first met you on your booth, and just really love her work. I have no idea who she was, but she spoke to me as a Chinese American in terms of what she has done. So I think the artists themselves are really figuring this out, their voice, through their art. And I think, but in terms of government, and going back to the government investment in it, my question is, if the Korean government pulls some money out of investing in soft power, would it continue? You know how countries, you invest in marketing campaigns, you throw in a lot of money in there, and then the products sell. So, and Hong Kong is also investing in that. There's been an announcement about Hong Kong government investing in PR. So I think it's important that we invest in the institutions, but in the long run, when the money is out, will it stick? Will arts and culture stick? So my argument would be, you can't just throw money at it. I think money is one aspect, corporate is one aspect, the government is one aspect, the collectors. When it comes to arts and culture, the institution has to be there as well. You have to build institutions to also promote that, because the PR money or the investment can be gone, but the institutions, and so for me, if I could go back to institutions, I love the Met. Living in New York, I became a member of the Met. Met is celebrating 150th anniversary this year. And then my first museum was the Palace Museum in Taiwan. And so I remember growing up, going to that museum as a kid, 5 or 6 year old. I have no idea what's in there, but I just know, hey, it's really a neat area. So I think the institution is really important, that we also have to invest in the institutions. And the government can't do it alone. Because right now, I think the government also has to figure out, the Chinese government, and let's say, give an example of the Confucius Institute. If we talk about soft power and government investment in it, Confucius Institute was supposed to be more like Alliance Française and the Goethe Institute. But for whatever reason, in its 17, 18-year history, it hasn't taken traction. In fact, many of the countries have shown distrust. So my understanding, early this month, the Chinese government is rebranding it. It's no longer Confucius Institute. They're going to call it Ministry of Education. I can't remember the full name. It's not a good idea. They need to work on the branding exercise.
Exactly.
But so I think it's only the beginning. So I do think that the Chinese government has to also look into it and figure out why there is some of the distrust, in why Confucius Institute has not taken off the way it had hoped, and learn from it. Because I think sometimes big countries like US and China, I find that when you're big, you don't know how to see from a perspective of a smaller country, or I'm 7 years older than my sister, and growing up, and also I arrived in the States. I was the oldest of the three. I made the decisions for my brother and sister because I'm the oldest, and my parents also relied on me, and so I was always this bossy the big sister, because I knew what was going on. And finally, when I was a teenager, when my sister was a teenager, I was already by then. My sister rebelled and said, "How come you are making all the decisions? What do you know?" And my sister's experience grew up very differently than I did. She arrived in the States when she was 3, and so she was rebelling against me and saying, "You're making all the decisions. You haven't taken into my consideration. You just went ahead and tell mom and dad we're going to do this when I'm not sure I want to do it." So that was when I realized, I may not know the best. And since then, I have to say, it was that I respected my sister as an individual. In fact, because of that relationship, she's now one of my best friends. I trust her on things because 7 years is almost in this day and age, it's like a generation. And so by not being the bossy big sister and listening to my little sister as a friend, I'm a better person for it. And so I think those are the lessons I would, for big countries like US and China, it's like, sometimes listen.
I agree. So big sisters and big countries can set, of course, we respect the countries and their policies and strategies. They could consider just setting a big infrastructure of an institution or so and allow organic growth and allow more of its citizens and other experts to help build from the ground. And that's why Ora-Ora has been working with so many amazing Chinese young artists since over almost 2 decades now, like 15, 16 years ago. All these artists whom I'm working with were in their 20s, but then when we look at them, just like yourself, like returning from the West after my educations, working in Hong Kong for a decade, when I went into China and see all these amazing young people having respect to their own heritage or a skill like the ink and the paper and thousands of years of history, but at the same time the art and the writing or the performances, whatever we come across, these artists just want to express themselves as individuals. And the reason why you are intrigued by some of the artists whom we represent is because they have this skill and eye and taste for the heritage part, but at the same time they are unique individuals with a vision of their own, and they want to make something out of their own life. So if these big institutions and big countries allow their own people to take bigger stakes in building those institutions, then maybe general people will find it more interesting.
Well, I think you mentioned the hardware, the institutions, the 798s and all of that. That's great. I think we need to invest in the hardware, but I think we also need to invest in the software. And for me, the artists, the people, the curators, I think they're equally important. I think it's not just the hardware, but the software. And so the artists themselves, I find that they have a vision that is really unique, and I think the world also needs to hear it. So we can't just kind of promote among ourselves. So I would like to see these artists, these global, that they become global artists as well. So why is it when I go to museums in the West, I always just see, I used to do these games, I don't see that many women artists, and then I also don't see that many Asian artists. And when I see an Asian artist name, I get so excited. And so I think the Asian artist is coming up, because again, going back to the demographics and looking at our history. So I think that's going to be the exciting part. And what you're doing is so exciting, because these Asian artists, the Chinese artists themselves, they have an eye, but they know where they come from, and whether it's traditional training, but then they parlay it into something that, and making other people see as well. So which is an exciting development.
Sure. And given we're here in Hong Kong, Alice, and I want to switch gear, and as Hong Kong being a very important international financial, cultural, economic center of China, and that, well, if we look at Hong Kong's in the 60s and the 70s, we were so amazing in our, not consciously building perhaps, but just because people were working so hard in building the film industry, for example, with movies there was kung fu movie, there were kung fu movies, there were ghosty horror movies, and of course the singers and pop culture as well, and we could see that during those years, Hong Kong was definitely in the center of creating this identity of an Asian and influencing our neighbors and perhaps the Chinese speaking people around the world. And now, after all these years, it seems like Hong Kong has lost its connectivity or competitiveness in a way. I know M+ is kind of on its way, and not just M+, but West Kowloon, Xixi Center is opened. And how do you think Hong Kong can reassert its influence in the region? Is it because we have West Kowloon and then we'll be fine? Or how should everyone, in different positions, whether it's the government, the artists, us, the audience, kind of help in a way?
I think Hong Kong, what I would argue, what you were talking about, that period, Hong Kong was in some ways capital of Asian soft power from the 50s onward, until I think maybe 70s and 80s, the film industry kind of was not as vibrant as before. And so for me,
but then our music industry was very canto pop, like in the '90s, where like karaoke, first, second wave of karaoke.
But I look at the two artists that I grew up with as a Chinese American, and when I went to the States in the '70s, was Teresa Tang, Deng Lijun, and Bruce Lee. Okay, these two were definitely icons, artistic icon, and they both chose to come to Hong Kong to grow their career and to live. And I find that fascinating. And maybe that was my own fascination with Hong Kong too when I first arrived in '88, my first trip, and then when I moved here in '92. So I find that Hong Kong has that ability again. It always did, because it has that roots. One of the things I noticed when I arrived in '92 when I immigrated, like Hong Kong is a Chinese city. You kind of, yes, it has the colonial background, in terms of over 100 years of the British being here, and with it, it's adapted and so on. But ultimately, I found my fascination as a Chinese American was that, well, how Chinese Hong Kong is or was or is, and it still is. But I think in some ways it also has that hybridity, like myself, of being, influenced by the West, right? So the way English is speaking here, and people are comfortable with Eastern and Western culture. So the hybridity of Hong Kong, I find that is still here. Yes, we're going through a lot of issues. Yes, it's not an easy, it's not easy these days. But that hybridity of Hong Kong, I think, is going to serve as its strength. And also, it's the soft power, I think, has been there. So the film industry, Anne Hui just got nominated, by Venice. Venice just recognized her for a lifetime achievement award. And you have Wong Kar-wai, who's still very much well looked after. Zhao Xingqi. So you do. Hong Kong still has it. So I know we're losing a bit of confidence this day, but I do feel like with one country, two system. That two system is still, is something that Hong Kong still has an advantage of. And for me, and this is why Asian Society wanted its first center in Asia to be in Hong Kong. So when we were established in 1990, it was because it is this hub. It is this Asian hub to, not just China. I think it's very important of Hong Kong's role in Greater China. But we're also so close to Japan physically, as well as Southeast Asia, rest of Asia, and also in this Hong Kong, we have a really dynamic Indian community. Whether some of it is from before, and some of it is new. Some of them are working here from the various industry. So I think that dynamism of Hong Kong is still there. Yeah, I really am really excited about, and that's one of the reasons I said yes to this job 8 years ago, because having worked in New York for 9 years, I saw it. I mean, right now, when I was there in New York, the hottest chef in New York was a Korean American, David Chang of Momofuku fame. Asian Americans was actually quite trendy in New York. You could see them in Brooklyn. You can see them in New York. The food, the fashion. I mean, look at Jeremy Woo. Some of these wonderful Asian American designers, and so I know that excitement that I saw in New York, that 9 years that I lived there, of the energy of the Asian American. I also see some semblance of it here in Hong Kong, but. The problem in New York was they were not mainstream. In some ways, they were almost, I hope they weren't trends, because these artists and these designers and artists, they carved, they got noticed by the museum director, the museum curators, and so on and so forth. So they were pioneering. They were making waves, and so there were some wonderful artists that I kind of got to see, and I say, oh. They kind of broke grounds in some ways, made many of the Americans or New Yorkers look at Asian artists or Asians in a different way. So I think Hong Kong now just has that hub of it, and I think it can continue that push to promote, to celebrate Asia today.
I agree, and I totally agree that Hong Kong has all the advantages and the skill set and the talent and also geographic location to first hopefully show the world, like to identify the different cultures for the world.
Correct.
That there's Koreans, Japanese, and Hong Kong, Chinese, and everyone has a different kind of background, and things that concern them will be different. I still have very strong faith in Hong Kong that Hong Kong has this ability to create a voice and a perspective that is global and not like a kind of twisted Western perspective in the Orient.
Right.
Or we don't actually use that word, but then they always call Asia Oriental and the Orient, right? Because the center is not here.
Right.
But here in Hong Kong, we can kind of affirm that like a global, a more international, and more open-minded perspective, even when we judge
Right.
culture or art and all that. Hopefully that people will continue to put resources.
Right.
I look forward to seeing more corporations and big developers and big corporations in Hong Kong and in the region building Hong Kong as a very like unique hub.
And that's why I'm excited with West Kowloon, all of West Kowloon, and M+ and the Palace Museum Hong Kong, because I go back to about the Met example. 150 years, right? Met was started by the city gave them the land, right? So the government was involved, the corporate sector, the collector was involved. And you look at, when you go to New York today, you know, the two of us, when we go to New York today, it's the Met. Unfortunately, they're closed until end of August. But
MoMA and the Met.
But the institution started with Met 150 years ago. We're seeing that here in Hong Kong. You know, so we're going to see Asian artists in M+. And even the refurbishment of the Museum of Art has been, I got to see it about a month ago when it was open, when I had a chance to see it. Loved it, because through that Museum of Art, some of the Hong Kong artists I did not know. I did not know the history. I knew some of it. But I think institutions like museums and art institutions has a role to play. And that's why you have to invest in it, whether the government invests in it, corporate invests in it, collector invests in it. It was great to have Art Basel. It's still great to have Art Basel. I think Art Basel has, you know, we grew, Asian Society Hong Kong, when we opened in this center in 2012, was also the first year of Art Basel. So the art fairs is also very important. The galleries are very important. Right now, you know, from the Art Gallery Association, from 8 years ago, how many, and now they're over almost 50, right?
Sure.
So I think these institutions are important. So collectively, we're all important, but we need to connect. And that's why I'm so excited. One of the involvement been with the Art Power Hong Kong is connecting the art and ecosystem of Hong Kong, but then also later on, the ecosystem of Asia as well. Because when we can grow together, we will be able to really highlight. Asian artists or Asian has to have a seat at the table in global art.
And I think the board of directors and the leadership in all these institutions have to realize that although they are making decisions for all the stakeholders include the general public, and they really have to break down bureaucracy. I can see that like successful institutions have very slim structure, and they listen to people, they listen to the team, and they have very, very fluid structure and channels to direct feedbacks to board. And not to middle, because without decision makers understanding that bureaucracy doesn't work in building soft power, and bureaucracy doesn't work in you know, really confirming a cultural identity, this won't work, because artists, galleries, it's like smaller stakeholders working to grow the scene organically have very little decision-making power in, for example, West Kowloon. And at the moment, there are very, very few people would actually come to talk to the stakeholders as to how Hong Kong people want West Kowloon to be like. And also all these different amazing talents and working in West Kowloon may not be talking directly to the stakeholders. So I think having a fluid channel of communication and ridding the bureaucracy and really work towards building a cultural identity of the place is super important.
I agree. I think it's this global-local connection is something that I think for me, West Kowloon is going to be for all of us. And it's going to be for a long time. If you look at going back to the Met example and even the Palace Museum in Beijing, it's been a museum for over 100 years. So I think it's really important that they think ahead and don't think of it just for now. I mean, you're right, the bureaucracy sometimes.
The vision statement,
yes.
like what we're talking about,
yes.
may not be what the vision statement of this
Correct.
huge institution is. Do they actually want Hong Kong to have this soft power? What is the actual vision statement of West Kowloon? To entertain Hong Kong people, or does it have a bigger impact?
Well, I think I take heart in that when they create it, it's called M+, Museum Plus, right? So I'm looking at that plus. What does that mean? So it's going to be exciting to see it grow, and also to see it engage with the public, with the stakeholders. And but I think it's going back to what I said about U.S. and China. When you're big, you sometimes don't listen. And I think the listening part of it is going to be really important to help it grow so that it can stick. Going back to what I said about soft power, you need to have roots.
And also, I think for these leaders, they need to take risk. And the reason, listening to people doesn't really count as taking risk, because I listen, I don't know if I need to digest it and to act upon it. But having some decisions, some decisions to be made by a bigger general group of people,
right,
would be much more representative than having a table around to make all the decisions.
Correct. Agree.
So after all this time, I want to focus a little bit on Asia Society. So as the leader of Asia Society Hong Kong Center, like with all the things that we have discussed, Alice, what is your vision, and how are you going to shape the soft power of Asia through this institution in connecting with the world?
Well, our vision, I think, definitely has gone through a lot of revision since COVID and this last year of unrest. What I had hoped to do this year, as I mentioned, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary, is to look forward the next 30 years. Because what will Asia be like in the next 30 years? And not just Hong Kong or China, but Asia or the world be like in the next 30 years. Because it'll be 2050, 2047 will have already been over. And so for me right now, because of COVID and financially we have to fundraise, we do not have an endowment like other institutions. We do not have a jockey club like Daigun. So we really have to really look at ourselves. Where do we see ourselves in the future? And so that will help us in terms of the resources. So what I hope to do in the next couple of, this year, is really look at how do we, Asia Society Hong Kong, as an institution, how do we help connect the dots, not just with the institutions here, how do we collaborate with Hong Kong institution, the art ecosystem, but also how do we collaborate and connect the dot with the cultural institutions in Asia, as well as globally. Our wonderful Chantal Miller Gallery, thanks to Bob and Chantal Miller and the Miller Theater, even though they're small, it's a jewel box theater, and it's a wonderful gallery. I think with it, we can do a lot of exciting programs and exciting exhibition to help us look ahead. Don't forget our past, because we're a historical site. We're, as many people know, we're a colonial building that was founded by the British military shortly after the Opium War. So I'm always cognizant of that. We have to look back to look forward. So for me, looking forward is don't forget where we come from. In terms of as an organization. And Asia Society Hong Kong would not be where we are today. Right behind there's our donor wall, would not be where it is today with our supporters. So we're having a conversation with our stakeholder to see where we should be growing. And I really do look at it as, like you said, Asia, in some ways, the rest of the world look at Asia still with this maybe colonial lens with the way they look at Asia is the way their background. Whereas I would like Asia Society to kind of have an opportunity to present Asia today by the Asians themselves, young and dynamic, as well as those people with experience, kind of from an Asian perspective, and in telling its stories. I really do think the storytelling is very important. If we don't tell our stories, how would other people know? and also distinguish. Yet Asia is not a monolith. There are, the Koreans are very different from the Japanese. Japanese are very different from China. We're not all alike, and really celebrate our differences, and finding also the commonality. My old job at Committee 100, seeking common ground while respecting differences, 求同存异. To me, that is something that is really important for institutions like Asia Society to grow. And so it's not just about us, but it's about the region and the role we can play in terms of highlighting artists, playwrights, the young people, the community. I think that this is another thing that we're also looking at right now with COVID. I mean, it's not like there's not going to be other COVIDs. So how do we function in the age of digital? We can't, as you see, the exhibition is
digital
closed.
Audience,
yeah,
100%.
And right now our digital audience grew
Yes.
since February. So how do we now deal with it? So I had some ideas that we talked to our board a year ago, and not that they're out the window, but how do we refine that vision to make sure that we continue to exist and continue to be strong, and also grow with the other cultural institution that's coming online. And somebody would say, are you afraid? I say, no, I'm really excited about all the other cultural institutions that's coming online. It is just like rising tides raise all boats, and I think we're part of that. And we've just been lucky enough to be there ahead. We've opened in 2012, and we've learned a lot in this 8 years. We've partnered with a lot of wonderful organizations this last 8 years. We also learned a lot about our local audience. So to me, the vision is, the future is, how do we connect the dots of global, local, digital, as well as analog, and it's connecting the dots. It's that bridge, is continue to be that bridge, and continue to help grow, connect the dots. I have this thing about 1 + 1 = 3. As an institution like us, we have to be 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of helping the community grow, giving a voice to the community, and that's how I see the future of Asia Society Hong Kong.
That's great. I think from what you've described, and how we have experienced this place, Asia Society Hong Kong is definitely one of the biggest melting pot in breaking down these barriers amongst countries in Asia, and also to connect the dots in the world. Given the current, atmosphere with the COVID, and also generally in Hong Kong, how do you think Asia Society can nurture this more positive attitude, a positivity in culture or in society, or help in doing this?
I think we are needed more than ever, and that's one of the reasons I look forward to coming to work every day, more than ever, because I don't know about you, but sitting at home contemplating the end of the world is just not something that we want to do. I mean, right now there's so many differences, so many disconnects, and some leaders are not promoting cohesiveness. So I find that for me, coming to work is like, how do we connect? How do we make sure that we contribute positively? One of the things I said to the staff in February, when COVID was just starting here, we said, hey, there's a lot of misinformation about this. Back then it wasn't even called COVID, right? There's a lot of, how can we as Asia Society contribute to this? So we thought, there were a lot of wonderful Hong Kong researcher and medical professional. Let's go talk to them directly. So we started that in February 14th with our first COVID update, and we now are doing our COVID-19 19th episode next week. So for us, it's shedding light, not heat, and that's what our president often says. And it is really in times of crisis and in times of uncertainty, provide that certainty as much as we can, but also share the positive. There's a lot of positives. So the other day we had a wonderful young man posted on his Instagram or his YouTube channel the activities that he founded here on by himself. And that, to me, that just kind of shed a smile to my face. So for us, it's that we have to continue to be that positive in this world of so many negatives. And it's sometimes hard, and we need resources to do that. But with But one of the fun part is finding like-minded individuals, like-minded like you. We've talked about this a lot. Remember when we talked about AGA, the sculpture garden? We made that happen walking around. It's like, yes, the sculptures. I had always wanted a sculpture garden because I fell in love with Storm King in New York when I was living there. And it's like, why can't we have our sculptures here? And when we made it happen, working in collaboration with the Art Gallery Association. So whenever there's a negative, I want to focus on the positive. And I do feel like we have that capability with this site, with this wonderful center built for us, thanks to the Hong Kong government, thanks to Jockey Club, thanks to all of our supporters, but also we have the soft power. We have the software, our staff, and our docents, our volunteers. So for me right now is to focus on bridging and using the positive energy that we have to counter. So if you're sitting at home and you're getting bored and you're check out Asia Society Hong Kong website. There's going to be a lot of, like you said, the music, the concert that we were able to bring live a few months ago. So we're going to continue doing a lot of that in the months to come.